Alright then gang, so now we have a few things working in the application. We're fetching the data once in the home page, and we can also add new documents using the workout form. But at the minute when we do that, we only see that new documents after we refresh the page. And that's because our local React state for the workouts isn't being kept in sync with the database collection when we add a new document. So we just see the old workouts until we refresh the page and refetch the data again. So we need a way now to update our workout state in the homepage whenever we add a new workout document. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. We could force a refetch of the data whenever we add a new document to update the state, but that would be a bit excessive for fetching just one extra document, or we can just update the state locally whenever we successfully add a new document. And we'll be doing that using React context, so that we don't have to then start passing the workout state as props down to any component that needs to use it or update it. So React context is a way that we can provide kind of global state to many different components in the application. And then we can also update that state by dispatching actions from those components as well, a little bit like how Redux works. And the global state that we're going to be working with is the workouts data that we're going to fetch from MongoDB. So then, rather than passing the workouts state as props between components and pages to update it, we can just access it and update it directly then using a context provider from any component. Now, if you want to learn more about React context in depth, then I've got a whole series just about React hooks and context. So I'm going to leave a link to that series down below this video. But in this lesson, we're going to get right into the thick of it and make a context to manage our workout state. So to begin with, I'm going to make a new context folder in the source folder of the front-end application. And then inside here, we want to make a new context file, which I'm going to call workouts context.js. All right. And then inside this file is where we can make our context and a context provider component. So first up, we need to import a function from React called createContext. And this function lets us make a new context that we can then provide to components in our application. So once you've done that, you'll need to make a new context and store it in a constant, which I'm going to call workouts context. So we can set this equal to the createContext function, and we can invoke that function. And this creates us a brand new context. Now we also need to make sure that we export this as well, since we will be needing it later on in another file. So the next thing we need to do is provide that context to our application component tree so that our components can access it. And the way we'll do that is by making a context provider component. And this is just going to be a regular React component like any other that's going to wrap the rest of our application eventually. So let's call it workouts context provider, all right? And set it equal to a function. And we also need to export this function as well, since we're going to be using it in a different file later on. So inside this function, we need to return a template. And the template is going to be our workout context, so the thing we created at the top, and then .provider. So this is a component, right, given to us by the context that we created, and this is the thing that basically needs to wrap whatever part of our application needs access to the context. In our case, we'll wrap the whole application, the whole component tree, so that every component has access to this context. So at the minute, this isn't wrapping anything, and what it needs to wrap is the root app component at the top of the component tree, okay? So inside the index.js file that kickstarts the whole React application, we can see that component rendered right here. So it's this app component that needs to be wrapped by our context provider components. But how do we do this? Because I can't just copy this app tag and paste it into the context file. That's not going to work because we're rendering the app right here. So instead, what we can do is import the component that we just created, the workout context provider component, right here, and then we can wrap that around the app component. So let's do that. So let's at the top import the workout context provider component, and that comes from the workout context file. And when we've done that, we can just use that context provider component and we can wrap it around the app component. So now we've done that, we can go back to the context component and we can destructure the children property from the props in this component. And the children property represents whatever components or template this component right here that's accepting the props wraps. So in this case, the children property represents the app component that we just wrapped inside the index file, right? And so therefore, if we output the children inside this provider component, then essentially we're outputting the root app component, all right? So to do that, let's just use curly braces and then output the children. And that, my friends, is pretty much it. So just to recap, we created this custom workouts context provider component, right? Which returns the actual provider of the context that we created. This is the provider that needs to wrap whatever components will need to access the context it represents. The workouts context in this case it's going to be. So it does that, it wraps the children property taken into this component right here from the props. And that children property represents whatever components this custom provider component that we made wraps. And since it wraps the root app component in index.js file, it means that the children prop is that root app component. And then since this provider right here wraps that root app component, which in turn wraps all other components in our application, it means that all components will have access to our workouts context. Now, at the minute, the context actually has no state value, so it's not providing anything to the rest of the application. But we can provide a value by just adding a value prop onto this provider right here. And whatever value we set this equal to will be then available to our components. So for example, I could set this equal to an object with a workout property, which could then be an array of workout objects, right? And then this object would be available to consume throughout the application in any components. And by the way, I will show you how we do that later on. But first, it's not really practical hard coding the values that we want to provide to our application directly here, because the value of this will ultimately change over time as new workouts are added or deleted, etc. So instead, this should be a dynamic state value. So we could create some state in this custom component using the useState hook, and then we could pass that state value into here instead. And over time, we can update that state value with various functions to add or remove workouts from it. So that's definitely an option, but instead of useState, we're going to use a different hook built into React called useReducer. So let me first of all write all of this out, and then I'm going to explain what it does. So we're going to say const and square brackets, and we're going to extract the state and also something called dispatch, which is equal to useReducer, right? And that hook also needs to be imported as well at the top of the file. And it's inside this hook, this useReducer hook, that we pass two arguments. A reducer function name, which we're going to call workouts reducer, and also an initial value for the states. Now, that's just going to be an object with a workouts property, which is going to be null to begin with. All right. So that's kind of what it looks like right here. But what does this useReducer hook actually do? Well, it's similar to useState in that we get back a state value and a function, dispatch, to update that state value. And we also specify an initial value for the state as well, which is this object. But what's different about it is this reducer function right here, which we've not made yet. And how we update the state using this function and also the dispatch function as well. So if we want to update this state object, we first of all call the dispatch function. And inside the dispatch function, we would pass an object as an argument. And this object should have a type property, which is normally a string, all caps, that describes in words the state change that we want to make. So for example, this could be create_workout, right? If we wanted to add a new workout. Or it could be set_workouts if we just wanted to fetch all of the workouts and we wanted to set the entire workouts property. Okay, so that's the first property, this type property right here. It describes the state change. The second property is a payload property, which represents any data we need to make this change. So in this case, it would be an array of workouts objects. So that's how we'd invoke this dispatch function, and this argument inside it is known as an action. Okay, so when we call this dispatch function, in turn, our reducer function is invoke, which is this workouts reducer function right here that we've not yet made. And it passes the action into the reducer function so that it can do its thing and update the state using that information and data. So what we're going to do now is create that reducer function. Let me first of all get rid of this, and then let's go up here and we're going to export this as well, since we'll be using it in other files later on. We have a constant which is called workouts reducer, and we set that equal to a function like so. So this function takes in two arguments: the state, which is the previous state before we're making the change to it. So this is a reliable previous state value, and remember, that's just this object right here, whatever it currently is. So the second argument we take in is the action, which, remember, was that object that we passed into the dispatch function, and that object had a type property and it also had a payload. All right, so inside this workouts reducer, what we do is typically check the action type, so what we actually want to do with the data, because it might be that we want to delete a workout, or it might be that we want to edit a workout, or it might be that we want to add a workout or set them all, etc. And the action type would be different for each of those different changes. So normally what I would do is a switch statement right here. And inside here, I would look at the action type like so. And then we'd have different cases for different values of the type. So for example, if the case was set underscore workouts, that would mean we want to set all of the workouts. And what we do in each of these cases is return a new value that we want the state to be. So we return a new object in essence. So I'm going to return an object, and we only have one property. It's the workouts property. And basically it's going to be the action.payload, because if we want to set all of the workouts, then the payload property on the action that we pass into the dispatch function would be an array of all of the workouts. Okay, so that would be the first case. The second case might be to create a workout. So let's do create underscore workout like so. And then in that case, we want to return a value. And what do we want to do this time? Well, we want to return the workouts property inside the object. But this time around, it's going to be a new array, and we're going to add the action.payload, which is going to be a single new workout object, right? So we're adding that new workout to this array. Now we also want the rest of the workout data as well. So we can say comma and then use ... to spread the current state.workouts property. Remember, this is the previous states, and the workouts would be an array of pre-existing workout objects. So we're taking all of those and putting those in the array as well. But first is the new one. So we're kind of adding that one to the top. So we'd dispatch this kind of action, create workout, when we want to add something. Does that make sense? And all this is just for local state, by the way. We're not interacting with the database here. This is just to keep the local state in sync with the database. So we might add a new we might add a new workout to the database. And at that point, to keep the local state in sync with the database, we would dispatch a create workout action, so that locally in our application, we have that new workout as well. Does that make sense? Alright, so they're the only two cases we need at the minute, but at the bottom we do a default case as well in case none of them match, and in that case we just return the state unchanged. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the workouts reducer. That's all we really need to do here. Now also we need to provide the state and the dispatch in the value right here so that it's available in other components. So if in another component we want to use the state, then we can do. And if we want to use the dispatch function to update the state, we can do. And this needs to go inside an object like so. So we have a state property and a dispatch property as well. Now, the way we consume this context and these two values in our components is pretty easy. We can just use a built-in hook called useContext and then specify which context we want to use. But what I like to do is make a custom hook for each context that I have. For example, I'd make a useWorkoutContext hook for this context we just made. And then whenever I needed to use this context, I'd just invoke that hook. So let's do that. Let's make a new folder over here, first of all, called hooks. And then inside that folder, we want to make a file for our new hook, which I'm going to call useWorkoutsContext. All right, .js. And then inside this file, we're going to need to import two things. First off, we need to import the workouts context from the workouts context file. Remember, this is going to be the actual context, not the provider component or anything else, the actual context that we created at the top of the file. And then we also need to import the useContext hook, and that comes directly from React itself, which is what we'll be using inside this hook to consume the context, okay? So once that's done, we need to make the hook function, which will also export as well. And I want to call this useWorkoutsContext, all right? So we set that equal then to a function. And inside this function, we can make a new constant, which I'm going to call context, but you can call it whatever you want. And then we can set that equal to useContext, which is the hook we just grabbed at the top, and we pass in the workoutsContext object. So this hook returns to us the value of this context, which remember is the value we passed into the provider component, okay? So it's this object with the state and the dispatch function. So we have that object now stored in our context constant, yeah? And then we can just return this state at the bottom of the function, of the hook. And this means that every time we want to use our workouts data, we're just going to invoke this useWorkoutsContext hook and get that context value back. Now, another thing we can do inside this hook is just check that we're within the scope of the context we're using or trying to use. Remember, a context provider wraps a component tree that it wants to provide that context value to. In our case, that's the root app component, but it could have just been the home component or some other subtree of components. And if that's the case, it means you'd only ever be able to use this context within that tree of components. And if it's being used outside that component tree, then the context will be null. So in that case, instead of returning the context, which would be pointless when it's null, we can throw an error. So let's do a simple if check to say something like if not context. So if we don't have a value for it, then we do something. And the thing we want to do is throw an error. So we'll throw the error, and inside the error we can have a message which says something like, use workout context must be used inside a workouts context provider or something like that, okay? So, phew, that's pretty much all of the setup done, I think, and we can start to use this context in our components. And by the way, this might seem like a lot of setup for just a small bit of global states, but in the long run, it makes things much easier, especially when a lot of different components start to share and update the same state, okay? Alright then, so now we can go ahead and consume our context using this useWorkoutsContext hook inside our components. And we're going to do that inside the home page right here. So at the minute, we're fetching all of the workouts inside this home page, and then we're updating some local component state to store those workouts, right? But we don't want to do this anymore because we have that global context state for the workouts now instead. So instead, I want to use our useWorkoutsContext hook to consume our workouts context. Now remember, that provides us with these two values. The dispatch function, which we use to update this state, or this state right here using this reducer, and also the state object, which is this object right here, and that value might change over time. Now, what I'm going to do first of all is just use the spread operator right here, so that instead of just providing this whole object, what I'm doing is I'm spreading out the different properties inside this object, and we're providing those. So now this might as well just be workouts like so, but it would be state.workouts, right? So let's do ... state like so. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is use this hook right here to get this context value, and then we can destructure the workouts and the dispatch function from that inside the home components. So what I'm going to do is just import that use workouts context hook right here, and then we can use inside this component. Now, we no longer need this use state thing or update the local state right here, or we no longer need this use state hook from React. So instead, I'm going to invoke this hook right here, and then we can destructure a couple of things from the context it provides us with. So I can say const, and then we're going to destructure, and we want the workouts, and we want the dispatch function. Okay, so the workouts is null to begin with, since that is the original state right here. But once we've fetched all the workouts down here, we want to update that, and to update it we use this dispatch function. So if the response is okay, we can dispatch an action. And remember, this action has a type. Now the type in our case is going to be set workouts, because we want to update the entire array of workouts, and the payload is basically going to be the full array of workouts we get back from the server. So we'll say the type is set_workouts, and the payload is going to be the JSON data. That is the full array of workouts. And that's all there is to it, my friends. So now, when we first load this component, we're performing this fetch, and then when the response is okay, and we have the JSON data, we fire this dispatch function. Now that in turn fires this workouts reduce function and passes in the action. And this is the action right here with the type of set workouts and the payload of this JSON, the entire array of workouts. So we say, okay, well, it's this case. So return this new state object, which will update this state right here. And the workouts property is now going to go from null to whatever the payload on the action is. And that is the entire array of workouts we get back from the server. So we're updating that global context state now right here. And since we get that back as a value, and that's provided to us right here, this updates and we cycle through those down here. So now everything should work the same way as before, only now instead of using local state, we're using a global context. Alright, so now in the browser everything works the same way as before. That's awesome, because nothing should have changed, only now what we're doing is we're using that global context state instead of the local state inside the home component. So we know it's all working, however there is still a problem, and that problem is when we add a new exercise, well, yeah, that's fine, but it's not showing over here, and we have to refresh to see that new exercise. So we need to address that by updating this context value, the workouts in the context, when we add a new workout. So let's quickly do that. So we need to go to the workout form over here, and what we need to do is when we've successfully added a new document to the database, we need to dispatch an action which is going to update our context state as well to add that new workout to our global context state, and that way we're keeping our UI in sync with the database. Does that make sense? So this is the workout form. We need to use the use workouts hook inside here to get access to the dispatch function. So let me go to the home page and just copy this import right at the top. Let's copy that and let's paste it over here, and then we can invoke that hook up at the top here. So I'll say const, we want to destructure the dispatch function from the use workouts context like so. Okay, so we have that. Now where do we want to dispatch this action? Well, we want to dispatch it once we've successfully added it to the database, because if it's not been added to the database, it makes no sense to add it to our global application state. So we do it right here once the response is okay. Okay, so let's do it. At the bottom we'll say dispatch. We want to dispatch an action whereby the type is, I think, created, or it could be workout created. Let's just double check that. Oh, create workout. Let's grab that and paste it right here. So that's the type. Now the payload is just going to be the single document we've just added, the single workout. Because right here, when we return the new value of the state, we say that the workout is a new array where we put in that new workout right here. That's the payload, that single workout, and then we take the existing state workouts and we spread all of those current ones into that array as well. So the payload is just that single new workout we're just adding. So in our case, that's going to be this JSON right here, because when we send this post request, if it's a success, then the JSON we get back, the response we get back, is the workout we've just added. And we can kind of verify that if we go to the controllers, the workout controller, create a new workout. So we try to create that right here. This sends us back the workout we just created, and we send that as a response to the browser. So we can say that the payload is just that JSON response right here. That's going to add it then to the global context state. And I think, my friends, that's all we need to do here. So now when we dispatch this action and it updates the context state, the workouts right here, that's going to update, and therefore when that value updates, it re-renders the home component output that new workout down here as well. So hopefully everything should be in sync now. Alright, so let's just give this a try. Exercise title, doesn't really matter, any old junk, 30 kilograms, and then reps is going to be 20. If I add this now, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to see it appear straight away over here, or maybe not straight away, maybe after half a second once it's added it to the database and we get a response. So add workout, yep, and we can see it updates over here as well. Awesome. So now everything is working with that global context state.